This was a year the Fed came under the attack of President Trump, who tweeted about the central bank and its chairman, Jerome Powell, more than 80 times. With us to discuss this, as well as what's going on inside the White House, is John Tamny. He is director of the Center for Economic Freedom at FreedomWorks and editor of Real Clear Politics. Also the author of the book, Who Needs the Fed? John, the Fed not signaling any rate changes in 2020. Let me ask you to answer the question, which is the title of the book. Who needs the Fed? Don't we?
No, we don't. To pretend that we need the Fed to fiddle around with interest rates, that's necessary for economic growth, defies common sense. Let's never forget that the Fed projects its always overstated economic influence through a U.S. banking system that represents 15% of total credit in the U.S. economy. And let's stress that it's the least dynamic credit of all. Banks, as a rule, cannot lend toward growth and toward dynamic ideas. They have to lend toward sure things. But the U.S. economy grows based on new ideas constantly entering and pushing out the old. And so the Fed's just not...
Let me interrupt you. You just said the economy is based on new ideas pushing out the old. The financing for that comes from monetary policy. I mean, if we didn't have the Fed, say, in 2008, I'm not sure many of us would be employed right now. That's what they were talking about.
Well, but of course we would be employed. In fact, we'd be employed better precisely because when government actors enter into an economy and prop up what markets don't want, they naturally slow it. Let's never forget that Japan was literally reduced to rubble by World War II, but within a few years, it and Germany were two of the richest countries in the world. What kills a country is not the failure of a business. What kills it is government intervention. And so you look at the Fed. What could the Fed possibly do? It bailed out Citibank for the 5th time in 25 years. Can you give me a reason why the U.S. economy is reliant on Citibank? Has that somehow made us more prosperous, propping up what markets have been trying to put out of business for 3 decades?
This is an academic discussion because the Fed ain't going anywhere, at least in the short term, right? So given that the Fed exists and probably will exist for our lifetimes, barring a revolution of some kind or a bigger change than we have seen, what do you think the Fed should be doing, given reality, given not the idea that it's going away? What do you think the trajectory of the Fed should be next year?
I think you put it so well. The Fed's always going to exist because politicians always need a convenient whipping boy. But let's be clear what the Fed does, okay? So it regulates the banks. Okay, how'd that work out in 2008? The Fed exists as a lender of last resort, but by definition, any well-run bank would never go to the Fed for a loan because doing so is an admission of bankruptcy, at which point the Fed sets or tries to set the overnight rate that banks lend to one another at. We don't need the Fed for that. And so, yeah, the Fed's always going to exist. My only argument is that it's just not that important. And so the Fed, could it move rates down this year? Sure. Will that cause the stock market to rally? Well, ask the Japanese. They've been at zero for how long? How's it worked out for their stock market? Implicit in this idea that the Fed can just generate good times is that it can somehow predict what companies are going to be important in the future. Implicit here is that the Fed decide we're going to prop up the stock market, and in doing so, we're going to prop up 5 companies: Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and that were the biggest drivers of the stock market rally. But at the same time, we're going to engineer GE's decline. We're going to engineer Ford's decline. We're going to put Sears out of business.
John, hold up a second. We want to get Jared in on this.
Hey there. Okay, so the Fed's not going anywhere. It looks like they're on hold in terms of interest rate policy for the time being, but they're also expanding their balance sheet once again. Looks like risk markets are responding positively to that. What do you think? Where do you think this goes next year?
The Fed's always looking for a reason to be relevant, and so it's always going to act. I just don't think it means very much. Let's never forget that even if the Fed weren't expanding its balance sheet, it's not as though well-run banks wouldn't have a highly liquid market looking to liquefy the assets it has on its balance sheet. And so what I've always argued is what the Fed's doing is probably something that market forces might be doing on their own. The Fed can't alter reality, and how we know that is that if it could, if it were a fraction of as powerful as people want it to be, then then QE would have led to a massive economic boom, but it didn't. The Fed can only confirm reality, and so it expands its balance sheet. Okay, but ask yourself what would happen if the Fed didn't exist. Would banks somehow not have a market for their loans? I don't think so.
All right, John Tamny is the director of the Center for Economic Freedom at FreedomWorks. Thank you for being with us on this holiday day after Christmas.
Thanks for having me.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.